Morning and welcome to Elevenses. It's Wednesday the 29th of July and you're with Kevin Williams here of Survival Skills Rider Training. Welcome to my Better Biking Controversial Views and News show. You're actually watching a recording this morning because as you watch this I'm probably stuck on the A303 on the way down to Devon to visit a friend down there who lost his wife during lockdown. We haven't been able to get down there and pay our respects, so we're taking advantage of the eased off lockdown conditions to run down there this morning. I've got some interesting news for you today. We've got cancellations to the World Superbike programme, including the Silverstone round, sadly. We've got a look at some electric motorcycles being used, or at least being proposed for a race scheme up in Cumbria. We're talking about casualties as well and why they look like they are going to spike this year. So got some interesting stuff. Stay with us through the rest of the show. First of all, what's been going on with World Superbikes? Well, unfortunately, the calendar has been firmed up from the last stage, which had the British round down as a possible but not confirmed. Well, it has now been actually confirmed that it's been cancelled, and so that Donington Park round will also be joined by the Dutch TT at Assen and the Qatari race at Losail. They've all had the plug pulled for 2020. It's actually the first time in the World Superbike Championships history that there isn't going to be a British round. Assen has also been a permanent fixture on the calendar. Every Dutch round since 1992 has been hosted there, and no other circuit has such a long history of continued use. All three rounds were listed as to be determined when the updated calendar was released a few weeks ago, but no place has been found for either any of those three events, and the revised Superbike season actually comes to an end at Magny-Cours on October the 2nd to the 4th. Right now there are two more rounds which are still touch and go, and that's the Argentinian and the Misano round, which is in Italy. So I'm afraid if you were looking for a dose of British World Superbikes to cheer you up, you're going to have to wait for another year. Okay, so one thing that has been going on is alternative ways of looking at the world. People have been thinking about all sorts of plans to head forward from lockdown, and two friends up in Cumbria have submitted a plan to create an electric motorcycle racing arena which is a particularly sensitive area of the country, of course. Farmer Greg Hall has applied for a change of use to one of his agricultural sheds. He's at Wigton, which is about 10 miles southeast of Carlisle. The plans have been submitted to the local council, and the idea came about from a brainstorming session on how to diversify the farm. Mr. Hall said that farming's tough, and we wanted to do something that would cater to people of all ages. And as he points out, the bikes give off no noise or emissions, and everyone seems to be really excited. We hope, he says, if plans go through, we'll be able to open next summer. The idea is to provide a facility along the same lines as an indoor karting circuit, basically, but without the noise, and using 6 electric motorcycles. The big plus, obviously, is the lack of racket from the bikes, and the fact that it's far more environmentally friendly compared with petrol engine machines. Noise tests has already been carried out and found that the electric motorcycles are significantly quieter than corresponding 2- and 4-stroke engines. And if given the go-ahead, the facility would be open 7 days a week. It will be available to individuals and to corporate team building days, and it would create 3 new jobs in the area. So a little something positive about motorcycling there. But something else that I've come across is that there's increasing evidence out there that motorcycle casualty numbers are going to show something of a spike this year. Back at the end of May, a trauma specialist was saying that lockdown was seeing more bikers coming in requiring specialist care than in previous times. And other evidence has accrued recently from police reports from ROSPA and even a specialist injury lawyer. And the BBC have actually had a special report on this on Sunday. They said that police in Wales had counted nearly 50,000 motorcycles on the roads in one weekend during lockdown, and one resident called it living hell. ROSPA Safety Officer Michelle Harrington said Wales's spectacular countryside meant that people are crossing the border from England to ride there. Jane Woodcock, who's head of personal injury at Hugel Solicitors, who are up in Yorkshire, said earlier this month that it's something of a misconception that motorcycle accidents happen mainly in the worst weather conditions. Talking about crashes up there in Yorkshire, she said, statistics have repeatedly shown that the vast majority of motorcycle accidents actually happen in excellent weather conditions when riders like to get out and enjoy the open country roads. And basically that's confirmed by 2019 stats from Wales, which show that in that country 84% of their motorcycle crashes happen in fine weather. And neither is it surprising that, again, statistically across the UK, it's the months with the long summer nights, and particularly from June through till September, they're notorious of being the peak times for serious casualties. And that's year after year that's shown up. So whilst there are reports of few riders using the empty roads during lockdown as a racetrack, the trouble is that now roads are open again, motorcyclists do seem to be making out for lost time, and that doesn't mean just riding. It also means that with the increased mileage and the increased numbers out, the crash numbers are going up. Police figures from Wales, there's a road safety campaign out there called Operation Darwin, and that says there's a significant increase in bikers out on Welsh roads. Chief Inspector Tom Charville from Dyfed Powys Police, he said that on Saturday 11th of June 22,000 bikers were counted on their roads, rising to nearly 27,000 on the Sunday. Now by comparison, he says that they see about 4,500 bikes on an average weekday. And that was the first weekend when lockdown was released and people were allowed out onto the roads. And what he was saying was that basically that placed a huge demand on their resources. Chairman of the South Wales Advanced Motorcycle Group, a gentleman called Dave Hutton, has said that his members have been appalled by what they described as reckless behaviour during lockdown of a small number of bikers who were giving responsible riders a bad name. And he went on to say that there are a lot of really well-behaved motorcyclists, but they're almost invisible to the general public. And he went on to point a finger at a lack of enforcement and said there was a time when you would expect to see several police vehicles on a stretch of road, but now you can go on a long journey and not see any at all. Why might that be? Well, obviously cutbacks are one possible reason, the fact that the police have other things on their mind too, but also it says here that the police are now using technology to try to stop crashes. They're using live sensors on the trunk roads to try to record hotspots, which let officers get to the scene quickly. Now, I'm not quite sure whether that means they recognise when traffic has come to a halt, or whether they're actually detecting fast-moving motorcycles through these sensors. But whatever it is, the Chief Inspector Charville went on to say, it's not about targeting bikers or trying to catch them out. Rather, it's all focusing on ensuring the safety of riders in Wales. Now, so, to push on from this a little bit, just who is actually causing the problem? Well, the answer is that I don't think anybody really has a very clear idea. I just mentioned Dave Hutton, who's the, as I said, chair of the South Wales Advanced Motorcycle Group. Now, he claimed that the problems are with younger riders and born-again bikers who, he said, go back on the roads without training. The question is he actually right? Well, firstly, one thing we do know from accident stats is that the younger riders tend to have crashes near home. With smaller bikes, they're usually using them for sort of freedom of movement rather than for fun, and they're not doing long rides. They're not going out onto the rural roads in the same way as the older riders do. So younger riders tend to account for a lot of urban collisions near their homes, but relatively few of the open road fatal crashes that we've been seeing. My news feed is full of these in biking hotspots like Wales and Yorkshire. So what about the born again idea? Well, 20 odd years ago, I would have said maybe. Back in 1995, when I first started as a basic trainer, the direct access test was on the horizon, and particularly in 1995, the year I actually started, and then 1996, when I really cut my teeth, we had a flood of born-again bikers coming through the training school. Now, many of those had actually hung up their biking kit in the right back at the beginning of the 1980s, when you may recall, if you've got a very long memory, that the learner limit was cut from a 250cc machine to a 14.6 horsepower 125. Roughly speaking, something with a top speed of about 70. If you recall the 250s that led to that ban, you'll remember bikes like the RD250 LC, the Y, what was it called? X7 Suzuki. Two of the two strokes, the high performance two strokes. The X7 just about nudged 100. It was close enough that Motorcycle News could call it a 100-mile-per-hour bike. Probably didn't get there for most people, but it still gave those machines a pretty rapid turn of pace. And as many L-plate riders weren't actually bothering to get a test, the government clamped down on that by bringing in the 125 law. The result was that many of those riders actually hung up their helmets. They simply stopped riding. Most of them didn't make the jump downwards, as it were, to the 125. Now, many of those riders who were riding those 250s in the early 80s were teenagers, early mid-20s. Now, you think about those riders, by the time that they came through to do direct access, they were the ones coming back, the born-again riders. They would have been in their 30s, possibly even a little bit older. And as I say, for a couple of years, we were flooded with those riders. And the interesting thing, of course, was that back in those days, 1995, 96, before direct access, the test was taken on a 125cc motorcycle. Remember, that's what they were limited to, 65 miles per hour, 14.6 horsepower, and then they went out and bought a 600 sports bike, 140 mile an hour machine, and they bought them by the drove. The roads were full of GSXR 600s and all the rest, and they went out and they crashed them. Now, some of those riders will undoubtedly still be on two wheels, but think about the timescale. That's 25 years ago. Many of those riders will be nudging 60 by now. So they're hardly the same born-again class that they were 25 years ago. So the born-again generation that we saw passing through the training school 25 years ago are actually rapidly morphing into the newly retired generation. So I think we have to look elsewhere than for that particularly born-again explanation. I don't think it holds any water. So a bit of history. What happened when direct access came along in 1997? Well, it achieved several things. The first thing was, and I noticed this particularly as an instructor, how I had to work a lot harder as an instructor to get people through the test, was that it required a really significant upgrade to the rider's standard, to their technique in particular. Basically, riding a 125 really wasn't much of a challenge. If you dumped the clutch on that, nothing much happened. You could wheelie them, but it took some doing. You could wheel spin on a really slippery surface if you really did dump the clutch at peak revs, but again, it wasn't easy to do. But by comparison, the 500s that we were using for training at that time, something like a CB500 Honda or GS500 Suzuki, they could stoppie, they could wheelie, they could wheel spin pretty easily. I certainly remember plenty of stoppies on the brakes when people were a bit brutal with the front brake, and wheelies weren't uncommon either as people learned how not to let the clutch out. So riders simply had to learn a lot more finesse on those bikes, and they were able to carry those skills through onto the bigger machines that they were going to be riding later. So from that perspective, I think the training actually worked. I think it gave people better skills. It was also harder. Generally speaking, I would say that it took us a day longer to get people up to test standard on those 500cc direct access bikes than it had done on a 125, doing exactly the same training to get people to the same standard on the same test routes. So they got more training and they were better trained riders as a result when they came off the course at the end of it with their pass certificate, in my opinion. A second factor that I think nobody really gives much credit for is that direct access brought a lot more women into biking. There were female riders on two wheels pre-1997, but they were hugely outnumbered. Now, head out to any bike meet and you will see significant numbers of female riders. And that's produced a significant change to the riding demographic. Has that direct access created any negative effects? Well, I think there were a couple. One has now been closed, but back in 1997, you could still opt to take your test on a 125. If you did, you got a full license, but one with a 2-year power restriction. You may recall you were limited to 33 horsepower. But once those 2 years were up, the sky was the limit. So those riders really had no better skills than those trained prior to 1997 under the old 125 test regime, and they could go and jump on anything they wanted. Now that went out the window with the new structured licensing system, but a few of those, well, obviously quite a few of those riders did gain their licenses that way, and I do think that some of those are still out there on bikes, and I think some of those still haven't got some of the skills that they would have got from a proper direct access course. And I have to admit, something I completely failed to foresee, a downside of the direct access scheme, was that because the direct access test was performed on something like a CB500 or a GS500 or an ER5, those bikes, which to that point had been popular middleweight bikes, had been billed as that by the press as well, not just in riders' own minds. All these 500s were suddenly seen as learner bikes, and because they're the bikes that people learned on, instantly people wanted something bigger, better, faster, more expensive. The 500s suddenly seemed to be a class of were almost not proper motorcycles, which I feel was a big chunk of the problem. But it also happened that this all coincided with an industry arms race. Now, if you go back through the history of bikes, you'll find that there was at one point 120 horsepower voluntary agreement on power limits, and there was 186 mile per hour limit on top speed. But one of the things that kind of set the bar for a lot of riders was and has always been racing. What's that wins on the track sells in the shops the following week. That's always been the saying, and if anybody out there watching this remembers Ron Haslam riding a VFR 750 at Donington Park in the rain on a bog standard showroom bike that still had a number plate and a horn attached to it, and actually trouncing some of the works riders on their race bikes, you'll know what I mean, because the year's allocation of VFR 750 sold out on Monday morning after that race. So racing is an important way of getting a message over about what's a desirable bike for the road, and for reasons which I never fully understood, the World Superbike classes of bikes went from being a 750cc capacity limit to up to 1,000. Personally, I don't think it's improved the racing. I think the old 750 races were some of the best races ever. But what it has done is it's changed people's perception of what makes a right and proper sports bike. You know, instead of something like Honda's RC30 being a desirable machine, it's bikes like the BMW S 1000RR, which is now seen as one of the benchmarks, and people look at the 1000cc class as a road bike to be wanted. Now, before all you adventure riding sorts out there start thinking that the crash problem is all down to sports bike riders who can't handle their machines, take a look at what's happened to the so-called dual sport bikes that they used to be known as. We've gone from 500 and 600 and 650cc singles, the occasional twin. There was the Africa twin, you might remember, Transalp, which was originally 500. And they were, they could touch a ton. The Transalp just about topped it. The Africa twin got up to about 110, 115 miles an hour. But none of these were speed monsters. What they were designed to do was actually tackle dual sport riding. But look what happened to that class. It got slowly bigger and bigger. BMW have a lot to answer for here. They brought in the original 800, grew it to 1000. The 1000 stretched itself to an 1100, which became an 1150, which became a 1200, which became a 1250. So gradually, bit by bit, the engine capacity's gone up and the power has gone up to match. If I remember correctly, that original 800 BMW GS put out about 55 horsepower. The current ones are way over twice that. Why do people want these bikes? As I say, the adventure bikes that you can buy today would match the 750 race bikes from just 25 years ago. Easier to ride, easier to overtake, somebody told me when I asked that question the other day. And I said to him, think about it. How fast can you go round a 50 mile per hour corner? The answer is pretty obvious. It's 50, isn't it? You can't go any quicker around a 50 mile per hour bend. You might be able to get out of it again faster. You might be able to hit a higher top speed between corners, but given that the corners are the fun bits and also the bits that set our speed, really, there's not a lot that you can do extra with a bigger capacity bike except do straight line speed. And that brings us to the next problem, really, because the straights aren't any longer. Our roads haven't changed. If anything, the one thing that has changed is they have got busier. There are more cars, more heavy goods vehicles. There is less empty space between those vehicles, and something else to consider is those cars have got wider. There's less space between vehicles. And those cars also perform significantly better than they used to. Not only do they hold speed round corners a lot more than they used to be able to, but they can also get out of corners a lot quicker as well. What used to be a relatively straightforward overtake on a motorcycle now becomes actually much, much more tricky, because we still have to do the overtake in the same distance because those roads haven't changed. But the cars are travelling faster through the corner and faster between the corners. So we actually have to give the bike a lot more berries on the straight to get past in the first place. In some ways, the extra power of these bikes is a bit of a trap waiting for the unwary to actually unleash it. So what are the riding crashes that we have out on rural roads? Let's try and understand those as well, because I think that's important. There's three main categories. Junctions. Now, this is a slightly different problem from the urban junction crash, as you know from my Science of Being Seen presentation. One of the biggest issues with the Science of Being Seen is that drivers either cannot see the motorcycle or they fail to perceive it in the background for some reason or another. Junction crashes out on rural roads tend to fall into two categories. Either the turning vehicle starts the manoeuvre when the motorcycle is out of view, around a bend or behind a hedge or something like that, or the rider is actually in sight, but the driver thinks it's not going as quickly as it is. But in both cases, it's the rider who's travelling too fast to take evasive action in the distance that is clear. You'll remember that Roadcraft says that we should be able to stop in the distance that we can see to be clear. It also adds a couple of little extra riders to that. One, it says we can expect to remain clear. Well, obviously, if there's a junction, we should be expecting that road to be blocked at that point, not to expect it to be clear. And then there's well within. Well, that's another statement that often gets left out. So the full explanation is we should be able to stop in the distance, well within the distance we can reasonably expect to remain clear. That well within gives us time to react in an emergency, because we want to overcome the possibility of panic grabs and the freezing at the bars, which is a common problem on many bike crashes. So riders who carry too much speed into junctions, that's a significant issue. Corners, we fall off on bends, unfortunately, but they're slightly different. They're what they call a clusterfuck. Now, those are sequences of minor errors. Now, those minor errors are predictable. We all tend to make them. Run into a bend a bit too hot, go off on the wrong line, turn in a bit early, start drifting wide a bit too early. A whole series of minor errors, and again, I discuss these on one of my presentations. But the essential thing is, if they're predictable, they're also avoidable. We should know that we can make these mistakes, and if we know we can make mistakes like this, we should be on the lookout for them. And once we're on the lookout for them, we should get the warning signs that we're about to make them and try to avoid making those mistakes. But even if we do make them, most of them are actually correctable. The one that normally finishes things off for people is target fixation. Once we target fixate, we tend to run directly towards where we're going. People often talk about going where you look. Well, in an emergency, you look where you're going to crash, and it's very, very difficult to go anywhere else. The thing is, of course, when we do have a problem on a corner, we tend to run off the road into something hard, or rather more commonly, we run wide onto the other lane and meet something hard coming the other way. And that one's the big killer on rural roads. The other big crash is overtaking. And sad to say, this often happens on group rides. And this is one rider at the front setting a pace, and the others trying to follow and trying to keep up. If once you've overtaken at the front, you've done the easy job. You've been able to pick and choose your time. The riders behind are all trying to stay with you, and what that means is there are inevitably some people within a group ride who will take a bit of a risk not to be left behind, either because they don't want to be seen to be slow and holding the group up, or because they're nervous about getting lost or whatever, but they will take some dangerous overtaking opportunities. And where things go wrong on overtaking, well, there are a myriad of things that can go wrong, but two of the most obvious errors are turnings, overtaking near turnings and entrances where either a vehicle's pulling out or not, or the one you're overtaking is trying to turn in. That's remarkably common. Or simply running out of space towards oncoming vehicles. That may be that you simply misjudge the speed of an oncoming vehicle and there's not enough distance to get back. Maybe your gap vanished that you were aiming for. That's a common problem that hangs people out on the wrong side of the centre line. Or people overtake towards a corner and they tend to think about getting back before the bend, when they actually ought to remember that they need to get back before anything coming around the bend has reached them. If you're overtaking towards any blind space, you should be back on your side of the road at the absolute latest halfway to that distance, not as you just get up to it. Anything else we know? Well, we do know the age demographic. Most riders who crash out on the open road are usually somewhere in the 30-40 bracket. They're not youngsters then, and they're not the born agains. They're often on the larger capacity machines as well. So, yeah, okay, what can I say here? A2A license training, I think it has proved to produce better technical riders, but what I don't think it produces are riders with experience. How much experience riders have when they crash, we don't know. I had a chat with a Thames Valley police officer some years ago. He was trying to find out, but he simply didn't know. What we do know is the benefits of extra training. We don't know whether riders take it when they've crashed. But we do know that extra training doesn't necessarily have the benefits they're often told it would. We don't know what the answers are. There are no easy ones. But I do think we do need some joined up thinking on this. And that includes the people using the roads themselves, and me included. I go out there for ride for pleasure. For the safety groups trying to pin down the problem have to look beyond the usual more training would solve this answer, because I don't think it will. And we have to look at the training organisations themselves as well, who are trying to produce more skilled riders, and I think what they actually need to be producing are more risk-averse riders. So I think there are a lot of different perspectives, different ways of looking at this problem, and I think there are lots of different potential solutions to the problem too. It's not a simple one to answer, and I don't quite know how we would go about it, but what I do know is that as motorcyclists we have to be aware of our public perception, and right now we're not doing a very good job of telling the broader public out there that we are sensible and safe and skilled. Right, sorry to bang on about that at length, but I felt it was important to cover that. I'll be back Sunday, and hopefully see you all then. I hope I've given you a few things to think about. Hope I haven't depressed you too much. Alright, so for now, from Kevin Williams here with Elevenses, signing off. See you again soon. Thanks for watching.